In the quiet village of Newhaven, the sun usually brought warmth, but for Samuel it brought only sweat and hard work. Samuel was a poor farmer who owned nothing but a small piece of land and a heart full of kindness. One morning, as he hurried to the market with his last basket of yams, a loud horn blasted through the air. It was Chief Benjamin, the most arrogant man in the land. He was dressed in flowing white robes that cost more than Samuel's entire farm. As the chief's expensive carriage sped past, it hit a deep puddle. A thick wave of muddy water splashed up, soaking Samuel from head to toe. But worse, a tiny drop of that mud landed on the chief's sleeve. Chief Benjamin screamed for his guards to stop. He stepped out, his face turning red with fury. He didn't care that Samuel was drenched. He only saw the tiny spot on his own cloth. "You filthy rat!" the chief barked, his voice shaking the trees. "Do you know how much this robe costs? You have insulted the throne with your poverty." Samuel fell to his knees, trembling and apologizing, but the chief's eyes remained cold and wicked. If you are watching this video, please like, subscribe to the channel, and tell me in the comments where you are watching my folktale story from. I want to know how far it has traveled. Samuel stayed on the ground, his forehead touching the dirt. "Please, my lord," he pleaded. "It was an accident. The road is narrow and the puddle was deep." But Chief Benjamin loved power more than he loved justice. He looked at the villagers who had gathered to watch the drama. He wanted to show them what happens when someone crosses him. "An accident?" The chief laughed bitterly. "In Newhaven, accidents are for people who can pay for them. Since you are too poor to pay with money, you will pay with your pride." He ordered his guards to seize Samuel's basket of yams, the only food his family had for the week, and throw them into the mud. The villagers gasped in silence. Samuel watched his hard work being trampled into the earth. But the chief wasn't finished. "That is for the robe," Benjamin sneered. "Now, for my wasted time, you must crawl behind my carriage all the way to the palace square. If you stop, my guards will whip you." Samuel looked up, tears stinging his eyes. He was a grown man, a father, being treated like a dog. The mystery was why a man so rich felt the need to be so cruel. The walk to the palace square was the longest journey of Samuel's life. His knees were bleeding from the sharp stones on the road, and his heart was breaking with every inch he crawled. Behind him, the chief's guards laughed and poked him with their spears whenever he slowed down. The people of Newhaven followed in a long, silent line. They loved Samuel because he always shared the little he had, but they feared Chief Benjamin's wrath. When they finally reached the square, the chief sat on his golden throne and looked down at the exhausted farmer. "You look tired, Samuel," the chief said with a fake smile. "Perhaps you need a place to rest your head." He then made a shocking announcement that turned everyone's blood cold. "From today, Samuel is no longer a free man. Because he cannot pay for the damage to my royal dignity, his farm now belongs to the palace. And since he has no home, he will stay here and serve as my footstool. Whenever I sit in public, he will provide the rest for my feet." The injustice was so heavy, you could almost feel it in the air. Samuel's wife, Martha, and his young daughter, Grace, pushed through the crowd, crying and screaming for mercy. "Please, Chief Benjamin," Martha wailed, falling at the throne. "Take our clothes, take our pots, but leave my husband his dignity." The chief simply kicked her away with his polished leather boots. He looked at young Grace, who was only 12 years old but very beautiful. A wicked idea formed in his mind. "Since you are so worried about your husband, maybe you should give me something else," the chief suggested. He pointed a shaking finger at Grace. "I have heard that Grace is a hard worker. To pay for the remaining debt, she will come to the palace to work as a house girl. She will wash the floors and clean the toilets until I decide the debt is gone." Samuel tried to stand up, his voice cracking with rage. "No! Take me, kill me, but leave my daughter alone." The guards stepped forward, pressing their spears against Samuel's chest. The tension was rising so fast that the birds in the trees stopped singing. Samuel was trapped. If he fought, he would die, and his family would still be lost. The chief leaned back, enjoying the sight of the broken family. "Take the girl to the kitchens," he commanded. As the guards dragged Grace away, she reached out for her father, her small voice calling his name until it faded behind the heavy palace walls. Chief Benjamin then looked down at Samuel, who was still pinned to the ground. "Remember, Samuel, you are my footstool now. Do not make me angry or your daughter will suffer even more." Samuel didn't say a word. He went completely still. His eyes, which were once full of warmth, suddenly became very deep and quiet. It was the look of a man who was no longer afraid because he had lost everything. The villagers thought Samuel had finally given up, but they didn't know the truth. Deep inside his mind, Samuel was reaching back to the stories his grandfather told him, stories about the power of the mind over the power of the sword. He whispered a silent prayer to the ancestors, asking for the strength of water, which is soft but can break the hardest rock. The chief thought he had won, but the real battle was only just beginning in Newhaven. Life at the palace was a living nightmare for Samuel. Every time Chief Benjamin held a meeting with the elders, Samuel had to crouch on all fours like a piece of furniture. The chief would rest his heavy, dusty boots on Samuel's back, pressing down with all his weight just to hear the poor man groan. "See how steady my stool is," the chief would boast, laughing as he sipped cold palm wine. Samuel's wife, Martha, was allowed to bring him a small bowl of watery porridge once a day, but she wasn't allowed to speak to him. She could only cry silently as she saw the bruises on his shoulders. Meanwhile, in the palace kitchens, young Grace was being worked until her fingers bled. She had to scrub the massive iron pots used to feed the chief's many guards. The mystery of the situation was Samuel's silence. He didn't curse the chief. He didn't try to run away. Instead, he spent his time watching. He watched how the chief's servants whispered in the corners. He watched how the chief's greedy eyes followed every bag of tax money that entered the palace. Samuel was like a hunter waiting for the wind to change in Newhaven. One afternoon, a very wealthy merchant from a distant land arrived at the palace. He had heard of Chief Benjamin's power and brought a gift, a rare golden bird that could sing songs of peace. The chief was delighted and wanted to show off his human stool to the visitor. As Benjamin sat on Samuel's back to admire the bird, Samuel did something strange. He began to hum a very low, rhythmic tune. The sound was so deep it seemed to vibrate through the chief's own body. "Stop that noise," Benjamin snapped, kicking Samuel's ribs. Samuel stopped, but he looked up at the merchant and said, "My lord, the bird sings for the ears, but the earth sings for the feet. Does the chief feel the earth shaking?" The merchant looked confused and the chief turned pale. "What are you talking about, fool?" Benjamin barked. Samuel smiled a very small, mysterious smile. "A wise man once said that when the stool begins to talk, the throne is about to walk." The chief laughed loudly to hide his sudden fear, but the merchant noticed that Benjamin's hands were shaking. The first seed of doubt had been planted in the heart of the palace. The tension in Newhaven began to grow as the days passed. People started noticing that whenever Chief Benjamin sat on Samuel, the weather seemed to change. If the chief was particularly cruel, a sudden cold wind would blow through the square, knocking over the wine jars. The villagers whispered that Samuel's suffering was calling out to the ancestors. One night, while Grace was cleaning the chief's private chambers, she found a small, locked wooden box hidden under the bed. She remembered her father's words, "Wisdom is knowing where the shadows hide." She didn't open it, but she noticed that the chief checked that box 10 times every single night. She managed to whisper this to her mother during a brief encounter. When Martha told Samuel, he didn't look surprised. Instead, he whispered back, "Tell the village herbalist that the chief's sleep is haunted by a wooden box,
Ask him if there is a herb that makes a man dream of what he fears most. The injustice was still there, but Samuel was now weaving a web. He was turning his humiliation into a map of the chief's greatest secrets. The chief's arrogance started to turn into paranoia. He began to feel that everyone was looking at him differently. He started seeing Samuel's quiet eyes in his dreams. To prove he was still the boss, Benjamin decided to hold a grand feast. He invited all the neighboring chiefs to show off his wealth. He ordered Grace to prepare enough food to feed 1,000 people, threatening to beat her if a single grain of salt was missing. He also ordered Samuel to be scrubbed clean and dressed in a bright red cloth, not out of kindness, but so everyone would notice the human footstool even more. Today, I will show the world that I own the bodies and souls of Newhaven, Benjamin shouted to his reflection in the mirror. But as the cook started the fires, something went wrong. Every single fire in the palace kitchen refused to light. The wood was dry, the oil was plenty, but not a single spark would catch. The chief rushed to the kitchen screaming at the servants. Grace stood in the corner holding a cold coal. "The fire is waiting for a blessing, my lord," she said softly. The chief's face turned purple with rage.
"A blessing?" the chief roared, grabbing a torch and trying to light the stove himself. Nothing happened. The torch simply went out as if an invisible mouth had blown on it. The visiting chiefs were arriving, and the palace smelled of raw meat and cold water instead of roasted yams and spicy soup. The embarrassment was an emotional collapse for the proud Benjamin. He turned to the village elders. "Find out why the spirits are mocking me," he demanded. The oldest man in the village, who had always secretly respected Samuel, stepped forward. "Chief, the earth is cold because the heart of the man who holds your feet is cold. You have treated Samuel like dirt, and now the dirt refuses to give you heat." The chief looked at Samuel, who was sitting quietly in the square, waiting to be used as a stool. For the first time, Benjamin felt a chill in his bones. He realized that his power was built on the respect of the people, and that respect was dying. He marched over to Samuel and hissed, "Make the fires burn, or I will throw your daughter into the cold river." Samuel looked up, his eyes as calm as a deep lake. The chief's threat hung in the air like a heavy cloud. Samuel looked at his daughter Grace, who stood trembling by the cold stoves. He knew the chief was desperate enough to do something terrible. Samuel stood up slowly, his joints cracking from days of being a footstool. He walked to the center of the kitchen and every servant stopped to watch. He didn't use a match or a flint. Instead, he picked up a small piece of charcoal and held it to his chest. "Fire is like respect," Samuel said, his voice echoing in the silent room. "If you steal it, it burns you. If you earn it, it warms you." He then handed the coal to Grace. As soon as her small fingers touched the black stone, it burst into a brilliant golden flame. The stoves roared to life and the smell of dry wood filled the palace. The cooks cheered, but the chief felt a sharp sting of humiliation. He had been rescued by the man he hated most. Benjamin retreated to his chambers, locking the door behind him. He went straight to the mysterious wooden box, his hands shaking. He didn't know that Samuel had seen the fear in his eyes. The power in Newhaven was shifting. The grand feast began, but the atmosphere was far from happy. The neighboring chiefs sat on their ornate chairs, whispering about the miracle of the fire. Chief Benjamin tried to act like nothing had happened, sitting heavily on Samuel's back as usual. But something was different. Every time Benjamin tried to brag about his wealth, his voice came out as a high-pitched squeak. The more he tried to sound powerful, the more he sounded like a frightened mouse. The visiting chiefs began to cover their mouths to hide their laughter. "Is our great chief Benjamin feeling unwell?" one of them asked mockingly. Benjamin's face turned a deep, bruised purple.
He looked down at Samuel, but the farmer was perfectly still, his eyes closed in deep meditation. The chief felt a strange sensation in his legs, a tingling numbness that made him feel like he was floating. He tried to stand up to propose a toast, but his knees buckled and he fell face first into a large bowl of pepper soup. The guests gasped as the most powerful man in the village came up gasping for air, covered in red oil and pieces of meat. The emotional collapse was starting. As the guards rushed to clean the chief, Samuel stood up and wiped the soup from his own shoulders. He didn't laugh, he only looked at the chief with pity. "The ground is very hard for those who have forgotten how to walk on it," Samuel whispered. That night, the palace was filled with a strange, haunting music. It sounded like 1,000 flutes playing from beneath the earth. Chief Benjamin couldn't sleep. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw a vision of his ancestors pointing their fingers at him. He jumped out of bed and grabbed his wooden box, clutching it to his chest like a shield. He decided he had to get rid of Samuel once and for all. He called his head guard, a greedy man named Victor. "Take the farmer to the forbidden grove at midnight," Benjamin hissed. "Make sure he never returns. Tell the village he ran away in the night." Victor nodded, his eyes full of dark intent. But Grace, who was scrubbing the hallway floors outside, heard every word. She knew she had to act fast to save her father from the chief's final act of cruelty in Newhaven. Grace ran through the dark palace corridors, her heart thumping against her ribs. She found her mother, Martha, waiting by the back gate with a small bundle of herbs the herbalist had provided. "Mother, they are taking him to the grove," Grace cried. Martha didn't panic. She remembered Samuel's plan. She gave Grace a small pouch of grey powder. "Go to the guards' quarters. Blow this into the air before they reach the gate." Grace did as she was told. As Victor and the other guards led a bound Samuel toward the palace exit, Grace blew the powder from the shadows. One by one, the guards began to sneeze and rub their eyes. They became so confused they started walking in circles, thinking the palace walls were trees. Samuel looked toward the shadows and saw his daughter's bright eyes. He broke his ropes easily. He had been loosening them for days with a sharp stone he found while being a footstool. Instead of running away, Samuel walked straight back to the chief's bedroom door. He didn't knock, he simply waited. He knew the mystery of the wooden box was the key to his family's freedom. Inside the room, Chief Benjamin was pacing like a caged animal. He heard a soft tapping on his window. When he opened it, he didn't see a guard. He saw Samuel standing there in the moonlight. "I have come to return your shadow, my lord," Samuel said calmly. The chief screamed and dropped the wooden box. The lid popped open and a stack of old yellowed papers spilled out onto the floor. Samuel stepped through the window and picked one up. His eyes widened as he read the messy handwriting. It wasn't a record of gold or land, it was a confession. Years ago, Benjamin had stolen the position of chief from the rightful heir by forging the elders' signatures. The great chief was a fraud, a common thief who had built his palace on a foundation of lies. The injustice Samuel had suffered was nothing compared to the crime Benjamin had committed against the entire village. "So, this is why you fear the poor," Samuel said, holding the paper up. The chief fell to his knees, his face pale and old. He realized that the farmer he had humiliated now held his life in his calloused hands. Chief Benjamin scrambled across the floor, his royal robes tangling in his legs as he tried to snatch the papers back. "Give those to me, you peasant," he hissed, but his voice lacked its usual thunder. Samuel stepped back, his face as calm as the moon outside the window. "A peasant's hand is clean, my lord, but these papers are covered in the ink of theft," Samuel replied. For the first time, the roles were reversed. The chief was on the ground and the farmer was standing tall. Outside, the ghostly flute music grew louder and the village elders, led by the curious merchant, began to gather outside the palace walls. They had heard the commotion and the chief's screams. Grace and Martha stood among them, holding torches that cast long dancing shadows against the stone. The mystery of the wooden box was no longer a secret. Samuel walked to the balcony, holding the confession high for all to see. The chief realized that his wall of lies had finally crumbled. The silence that followed was more terrifying than any shout. In Newhaven, the truth was finally rising like the morning sun. The oldest elder, Timothy, stepped forward into the torchlight. He was a man of nearly 90 years, and his eyes were sharp. "Samuel, what is this talk of shadows and stolen ink?" he asked, his voice trembling with age. Samuel looked down at the chief, who was weeping silently on the floor. "Timothy," Samuel called out, "the man you call chief did not earn his throne. He stole the signatures of the dead to sit where he sits. He treated me like a dog because he feared that an honest man would see the thief behind the crown." The crowd gasped, a sound like a rushing wind. Victor and the other guards, still rubbing their eyes from Grace's powder, didn't move to help their master. They could see the tide had turned. Timothy reached up and Samuel dropped the papers into his waiting hands. As the elder read the forged names, his face turned from confusion to deep, burning anger. The injustice of 30 years was finally being weighed on the scales. The chief's emotional collapse was now complete. He was no longer a lion, but a trapped rat.
"Is this true, Benjamin?" Timothy asked, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. The chief couldn't even look up. He just sat in the depths of his own room, surrounded by the luxury he had stolen. The visiting merchant stepped forward, looking disgusted. "I have traveled many lands," the merchant said, "but I have never seen a king who feared the truth so much that he turned a wise man into a footstool." The villagers began to murmur, and the murmur soon became a roar of thief, fraud, oppressor. The tension was at its breaking point. Samuel walked down the palace stairs, his head held high. He went straight to his daughter, Grace, and took the heavy scrubbing brush from her hand. He threw it at the chief's feet. "My debt is paid," Samuel said firmly, "but your debt to the ancestors is just beginning." The dad, seeing that the chief was finished, opened the palace gates wide. The people of Newhaven flooded into the courtyard, not with weapons, but with the heavy weight of their collective judgment. The chief looked at the thousands of eyes watching him and felt smaller than he ever made Samuel feel. The elders called for an immediate assembly at the village square, the same place where Samuel had been forced to crawl. This time, it was Benjamin who was led there, his hands bound with the very ropes he had used on Samuel. He was stripped of his white robes and made to wear a simple sackcloth. The villagers sat on the benches, and Samuel was given a seat of honor next to Timothy. "In Newhaven," the elder announced, "wisdom has always been our true crown. Today, we return that crown to the light." The chief began to beg, promising gold and land to anyone who would speak for him. But even his own servants turned their backs. Martha stood up and spoke to the women of the village. "He took our food, he took our dignity, and he tried to take our child's future. Let the earth decide his fate." The mystery now was what the punishment would be. In African tradition, a man who steals a throne doesn't just lose his job, he loses his name. The karma was approaching like a slow, inevitable drumbeat.
Samuel stood up and silenced the crowd with a wave of his hand. He didn't look angry, he looked disappointed. "Chief Benjamin wanted a stool for his feet," Samuel said, "but he forgot that a stool is what holds a man up. Without the poor, the rich have nowhere to stand." He then proposed a punishment that was both fair and deeply humbling. "Since Benjamin loves the palace so much, he shall stay there. But he will not live in the chambers. He will live in the stables, cleaning the waste of the horses he used to ride. And for every year he sat on my back, he shall serve the village by carrying the water for the widows and the orphans." The villagers cheered, loving the irony of the sentence. Benjamin looked at Samuel and saw a king without a throne. He realized that Samuel's wisdom was a power that gold could never buy. The farmer had brought the giant down not with a stone, but with a piece of paper and a quiet heart. The lesson was clear to every child in Newhaven. Pride is a high tower, but it always falls into the dust. The transformation of the palace began the very next morning. The heavy golden gates, which had once been slammed shut against the poor, were unbolted and thrown wide. Samuel's family was the first to be led back to their farm, but they didn't go alone. The villagers, feeling guilty for their long silence, followed them with baskets of seedlings, new hoes, and steady wood to rebuild Samuel's barn. Chief Benjamin, now dressed in the roughest sackcloth, stood by the palace stables, clutching a heavy wooden bucket. His soft, pampered hands were already blistering from the coarse rope. He watched as Samuel walked past him, not with a look of triumph, but with a simple nod of acknowledgement. "The sun shines on the palace and the stable alike, Benjamin," Samuel said softly. "It is only the man who decides where he wants to stand." The mystery of the chief's power had vanished, replaced by the reality of his own weakness. He had to spend his first day clearing the filth from the very horses he used to ride with such arrogance. The injustice was being washed away, one bucket at a time, in the heart of Newhaven.
As weeks turned into months, the village of Newhaven began to breathe again. Without the heavy taxes and the constant fear of the chief's temper, the market flourished. Samuel's farm became the most productive in the land, not because he had more money, but because he walked with a heart full of peace. His daughter, Grace, was no longer a servant. She was now a student of Timothy, learning the ancient laws and the history of their people. True royalty is not in the cloth you wear, but in the truth you speak, the elder taught her. Meanwhile, Benjamin found that his new life was harder than any punishment he could have imagined. Every morning he had to carry heavy jars of water to the widows' huts. The women who once trembled when his carriage passed now looked at him with pity. Some even offered him a piece of roasted yam, which he took with a trembling hand and a bowed head. The emotional collapse he had suffered was slowly turning into a quiet, painful realization of all the years he had wasted being a tyrant. A great festival was announced to celebrate the anniversary of the village's freedom. People traveled from far and wide to see the farmer king who had brought a tyrant to his knees. Samuel refused to be called a king, preferring to remain a simple elder. "A crown is a heavy burden for a head that loves the soil," he joked. On the day of the feast, a surprising sight greeted the visitors. Benjamin was asked to bring the water for the opening ceremony. As he approached the center of the square, the very spot where he had once sat on Samuel's back, the crowd went silent. Benjamin did not look at the ground this time. He looked straight at Samuel and did something no one expected. He set the water jar down and knelt, not because he was forced to, but because he wanted to. "Samuel," he said, his voice cracked and humble, "I spent my life trying to stand on others to feel tall. I was the one who was truly poor." The tension of the past was finally released in that moment of sincere apology.
Samuel stepped down from the elder's bench and helped Benjamin to his feet. "Wisdom has finally found its way home," Samuel said, loud enough for everyone to hear. He took a cup of the water Benjamin had carried and drank it, signifying that the past was forgiven. The villagers cheered, and for the first time in 30 years, Benjamin felt a strange warmth in his chest. It wasn't the heat of power, but the glow of belonging. He was no longer a chief, but he was starting to become a man. Grace and Martha joined them, bringing a plate of food for the man who had once tried to starve them. The karma of the story wasn't a violent death or a bloody revenge. It was the total destruction of an ego and the birth of a conscience. The mystery of why some men are cruel was answered. They are simply afraid of their own insignificance. Newhaven had learned that the strongest footstool is a community built on respect,
where even the smallest voice can shake the tallest throne. As the sun set on the festival, Samuel sat on his porch, watching the stars. His farm was thriving, his family was safe, and the village was at peace. He looked at his hands, which were still calloused from the earth, and smiled. He knew that the story of the cruel chief and the wise farmer would be told for generations to come, a candle to light the way for anyone facing an oppressor. Chief Benjamin remained in the village, a humble servant who eventually became a teacher of humility to the young boys. He taught them that a leader's greatness is measured by how many people he lifts up, not how many he steps on. Samuel's grandfather had been right. The mind is indeed stronger than the sword. The story of Newhaven became a legend, a reminder that injustice may have a long day, but truth always has the final night. Samuel closed his eyes, listening to the peaceful sounds of a village that finally knew the difference between a ruler and a leader. The story you have just heard is a beautiful African tale I heard long ago. I'm telling you to wake your minds to the truth that your character is your true wealth, and no amount of power can shield a heart built on lies. If you were the protagonist, would you have forgiven the chief so easily, or would you have demanded a harsher punishment? I want to know your opinion, because every story is like a candle that can light the path for someone else. God bless you, and may courage guide your hands. Meanwhile, on the final screen, I am leaving you with one of the channel's most beloved folktales. I'm sure you will love it. Thank you for staying with me until this moment.